Security Kitchen Productions presents Doctor Who, The Missing Adventures. The Romance of Crime, written by Gareth Roberts. Read by Marcus Cotton. Chapter 1. The Killings. It was not a planet for humans. Steaming blue slime shifted constantly, the top layer of the boiling sludge that coated the planet's compacted core. Bogs gulped fermenting pools in which chemicals combined oddly below treacly, inflammable gases. Patches of the gas cleared occasionally and revealed bright, near stars. The growls and belches from the ground accompanied the low note of the slow wind. 3 figures appeared through the thick screen of gases, tramping with difficulty through a mire. They wore bulky, black Atmos suits, rubber-jointed at elbows and knees. A range of equipment was slung over their shoulders and strapped to their sides in metal webbing pouches. Tiny sprinklers sprayed their faceplates every 15 seconds. Their bearded faces were uplit inside their helmets. The oldest of the men, their leader, stepped forward and pointed to a nearby ridge of rock.
I was right. It's behind there.
One of his companions unpacked a large communicator from his equipment pouch, sprayed its indicator panel clean with the sprinkler on his wrist unit, and punched in a recognition code on the panel below with slow, metal-gloved fingers. He waited a few seconds. The others heard his sigh over their radio links.
Still no response.
The third man said,
There has to be a fault back at base. I still think so. I reckon a storm or something knocked down the communicator aerial. I think that's what must have happened.
The leader did not comment. He had heard a number of the young man's theories in the 3 days since contact with base had been lost and contributed several of his own. None of them were convincing. The base had been constructed to stringent standards, and its power source, external transmat link, and communication systems were backed by infallible fail-safe mechanisms. So why had they lost contact? It had baffled the expedition from the start. They had sunk a deep rig in the wasteland as intended and collated results for 2 uneventful days. Early on the 3rd day of the mission, the hourly check call from base had not come. Moments later, the guidance line had snapped out. The team had assumed the fault was with their equipment, possibly influenced by a small increase in local magnetism, but a thorough check on systems and backup components confirmed that these were functioning normally in the circumstances. They had waited a few hours, continuing with their work in the belief that this was only a temporary error. At any moment, the communications would crackle back to life, and a voice from base would appear to explain everything. After all, this planet was renowned for the ability of its super-dense atmosphere to muffle signals and baffle sensors. But no reply came, and the leader decided to turn back. Without the guidance line, the team were forced to rely on their own sense of direction and a flimsy, grime-coated metal map. It had taken 3 days to retrace their route. The outward, computer-aided journey had been covered in 1. On a shorter journey, they would have used the base's skimmer, but the board had not wanted to risk flying it over uncharted territory. Now they were back at last. Over the ridge was the deep valley of solid ground selected by McConaughey Mining for the establishment of its base. Their leader squared his shoulders inside his Atmos suit.
Right. Over we go.
He took a leap forward and scaled the ridge in 3 jumps. The others followed. The base consisted of 3 low, rectangular outbuildings housing storerooms and laboratories connected by narrow walkways to a central dome. Windows lined the walls. The wind had covered the base's metal plates with dark blue dirt. An aerial, which served to carry radio, video, and transmat information, stood unbowed next to an emergency launch pad. There were no signs of activity inside or outside the base. The survey team padded down the sides of the valley and leapt over to the dome's entrance. The team leader flicked open his personal radio channel.
Survey team to base. This is Hogan. Request entry.
There was no response. He stepped forward and keyed his emergency entry code into the panel next to the airlock. The youngest man shuddered.
If that door won't open,
He said.
we'll be trapped outside.
He looked behind him to the barren surface of the planet.
What a place to die.
He raised his hands to his helmeted head and took deep breaths. Hogan recognized that as a training exercise that was supposed to quell claustrophobia. It didn't work. The panel beeped its agreement, and a few seconds later, they heard bolts drawing back automatically. The airlock's shield swung open, and the team clambered through into the base. The shield swung shut behind them, and the compression process began. An indicator on the wall of the small chamber flickered from red to green as oxygen was released. The three men stood in silence, obeying drill. A minute passed. The internal door opened. The youngest man reached for the seals of his helmet.
I've got to get out of this thing.
Hogan stopped him.
Wait.
He carried out a sensor check using his wrist unit. A red light winked.
Life support's gone. No oxygen. Temperature 100 below zero.
He lifted a leg.
Grav field's off too. They must have been holed,
said the third man.
Hope they got out in time.
Hogan shook his head.
No. It's a vacuum. The support systems have failed.
He stepped through the internal door. The base was unlit, and the bodies were revealed in beams cast from the team's helmets. Their 20 friends and colleagues lay frozen in small groups. Frosty white bile was splattered around their blue-lipped mouths. Their limbs were twisted, the fingers of grasping hands outstretched like claws. The youngest man was crying. He was crouched against a wall. Nearby was Dr. Cooper, who often used to sit with him in the refectory and who had beaten him in a poker game only last Friday night. Her face was lit by the report she had been compiling. Planet 11 Mineral Survey. Month 3, Day 3. Relative date the 28th of February. The board may be interested in the results transmitted by the survey team. Their deep mini-rig has uncovered only a small seam of iron ores, as expected, together with the anticipated access of low-value minerals, including guminum, portazol, and a trace deposit of helicon. We must assume that the Gilharo mountain range beyond will provide similar findings, and this will be confirmed by the end of next week. So, finally, we have reached our conclusion. Planet 11 is further from the company's standard exploitation threshold than we might have hoped. It remains the board's decision whether to move in, but I would remind the director that although a full mining option is obviously unfeasible, limited exploitation may. A cursor flashed at the end of the report. The young man pressed a button on his wrist unit, and a mint fragrance coolant was released into his helmet. He looked up as he sensed a presence. His colleague had returned alone.
Where's Hogan?
His colleague's face was pale under the faceplate, and there were blobs of vomit in his beard. His voice was cracked.
Gone to check the life support unit. He reckons Carl went crazy and turned off the life support himself. Carl?
The computer operator and life support technician had been one of his closest friends.
No, I don't believe that.
The other man's face dropped.
Hogan says only Carl had the know-how to override the safety checks. Lots of the other computers had gone crazy as well. Everything's gone from survey records. What about the transmat? Disaligned, but we've counted the bodies. Everyone but Carl's accounted for. Nobody else had the time to get to the transmat, or even to send the distress beacon.
He put his hand on his colleague's shoulder.
It must have been over in under a minute.
The voice of Hogan crackled in their ears.
Davis, Wilkin, I'm at life support. Get over here.
The two younger men stepped nervously into the humming life support chamber. Rows of neons bathed it in amber. Their leader stood in the center of the large room. His head was lowered. At his feet was an oddly shaped bundle.
Mr. Hogan?
He looked up.
It wasn't Carl who did this.
He indicated the bundle and turned away, sickened.
That's Carl.
The younger men looked down. They saw that the bundle was a set of overalls containing a flattened mess of skin, bone, hair, and blood. The body of the system's operator had been compressed. Hogan walked over to a panel in the corner and pressed his thumb down on a button marked Emergency Distress. A light next to the button started to flash. He crossed over to a window and looked out onto the surface of the small, worthless planet. The youngest man spoke.
Somebody got in then. From outside.
Hogan nodded.
lie.
The base shuddered as the distress beacon, flaring red, shot from its mooring on the top side of the dome. The three survivors watched as it sizzled up and away through the gas clouds.